Good morning. And this is the Adult Sunday School lesson from Mount Vernon Baptist Church for January the 24th. We continue our study journey through Genesis today. And before we begin, we must once again remind ourselves and all that come to us that we must be much in prayer against the virus. We see it is continuing to rage. More members of our assembly now have the virus. Some are in the hospital. We must be strong in prayer cover for these. For those who battle the virus, the doctors and the nurses and those who actually are contracting the virus and battling it with their own lives. Let's be much in prayer for this, and let's not possibly go weary from well-doing. Today our lesson is taken from Genesis 34 and 35, and the title of our lesson today is Back to Bethel. Our application is very strong today. It is that the student will accept that spiritual renewal is often necessary. Every Baptist member understands that application well, because we as Baptists call that revival. Now, as we look at what's happening today in this study journey stop, I think it's important that we take upon ourselves as we begin just a very few verses of scripture out of chapter 34 to help us to begin. So the book of Genesis, chapter 34, we'll first look at the first 5 verses, 1 through 5, chapter 34. And Dinah, the daughter of Leah, which she bare unto Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. And when Shechem the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and defiled her. And his soul clave unto Dinah the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the damsel, and spake kindly unto the damsel. And Shechem spake unto his father Hamor, saying, Get me this damsel to wife. And Shechem spake again to his father, and Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field, and Jacob held his peace until they were come. Now if you'll skip down to verses 25 through 30, we see it came to pass on the 3rd day when they were sore that 2 of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword and came upon the city boldly and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and spoiled the city, because they had defiled their sister. And they took their sheep and oxen and their asses, and that which was in the city, and that which was in the field. And all the wealth and all the little ones and their wives they took captive, and spoiled even that which was in the house. And Jacob said unto Simeon and Levi, Ye have troubled me to make me stink among the inhabitants of the land. Probably today what we study is, if not the most, one of the 2 or 3 most sordid episodes in the entire Old Testament. We have here today a most difficult lesson which is given to us that we may understand the consequences of partial obedience. Things happen in this episode which are terribly tragic, and we see exactly what happens when one disobeys the Lord. Now, after God had successfully led Jacob through the meeting and reconciliation with Esau, his brother, the Lord is ready to lead Jacob all the way home. He told Jacob in 31:13 that he was to leave the place he was in and go to Bethel, where he had met the Lord over 20 years before, and to dwell now in the land of his kindred near Hebron. Instead, Jacob stopped at Succoth and actually constructed houses there and appeared to settle into a permanent life there. And we should recall that Jacob promised Esau he would see him in Seir, but Jacob did not keep his promise and settled into life in the land of Shechem. He did build an altar, but he had disobeyed God when he settled there. We must recall the strong lesson that we learn later in 1 Samuel 15, that to obey is better than to sacrifice. Jacob and his family paid a great price for his partial obedience. Another most awful episode takes place as we enter chapter 34. Before this chapter, Jacob had admitted that he knew his family was carrying false gods, and these idols were actually inside his home. He did command the removal of the idols, and he buried them forever under an oak tree in Shechem. But before the family left, there was a most terrible event that happened to the family. We had mentioned before that after so many sons born to Jacob from Leah and Rachel and their handmaids, finally Leah gave birth to a daughter, Dinah. Now Dinah was a young woman, and she sought out other young women of her age within the people of the Hivites, a pagan people who lived nearby. And as she walked with her new friends, the prince of the Hivites, a man named Shechem, noticed her and lusted after her. He took her into his dwelling, and there he raped her. After the fact, he said that his lust had turned to love, and he asked his father to arrange that he may marry her. The father Hamor and the son who violated Dinah visited Jacob to ask for her hand in marriage. Two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, also born of Leah, heard of the matter and were determined to avenge the honor of Dinah, which had been defiled. Hamor wished a peaceful end to the matter, and he said that he would be happy for much intermarriage between their peoples. Here we recall that Esau married two pagan women, grieving both Isaac and Rebekah, for such mixing was against the command of God to Abraham. The brothers proposed a counteroffer to supposedly prepare the men of the Hivites for such marriages with the women of Jacob's family. They said all the Hivite men should be circumcised, and then they could allow the marriages to occur. The Hivite men, looking for an easy way out, agreed to this arrangement with the assurance that this act would settle the ugly violation of Jacob's daughter. So on the third day of the process, after the circumcision of all the males, when the pain from the act would have been the most harsh, the Hivite men were all struggling and suffering, trying to heal, and Simeon and Levi personally went to bring Dinah home and killed all the men of the city with the sword. While Jacob was troubled against the acts of his son, it was hard for him to condemn the deception of the sons, since he himself had led a life of strong deception. Simeon and Levi showed no remorse whatsoever for what they had done. But not only had they killed all the men, but they had also taken the women and the children as servants, as well as plundered all the wealth of the city. Had Jacob obeyed the Lord's command to travel to Bethel, all of this terrible episode would never have happened. He had been ineffective as a husband, a father, and now as a leader of his people. The weakest thing that Jacob did was to forget that circumcision was a gift of God for Abraham's people and for none else. It was proof in the flesh of the covenant God gave to Abraham. This special gift of God was never to be bargained away to pagans, and Jacob had agreed to do exactly that. Our two study chapters allow us many lessons on the moral issues, the faith issues, the family issues, and the issue of obedience. Jacob became fully restored to communion with God after he returned to Bethel and set up the altar there where he had spoken directly to God in chapter 28. After reaching Bethel, the final portion of the journey commanded was for him to go to Ephrath, which is the original name of Bethlehem. And here Rachel died and was buried. We have been further given quite a few issues of further types and shadows of the time ahead for the chosen people in these chapters. Just as Jacob left the house of God and journeyed far away, the nation of Israel will later do the same. Just as he called Jacob home, the Lord will later do the same to the chosen nation. And this began in 1948 with the nation of Israel reestablished. Jacob was called to cleanse his family of pagan idol worship, and after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans, Israel never again worshipped idols. Jacob acknowledged in 35:3 that God had answered him in his day of distress, And God has promised to do the same of the cry of his people in the great tribulation time as taught to us in the Revelation. Just as God appeared to Jacob again, so will he also appear to the Jewish nation on the Mount of Olives at his second coming. Just as much prosperity was promised by God to Jacob in 35:11, and it came true, the same blessings are now seen as the new nation of Israel has been shown by God how to make the desert places fertile and to bloom in our own time. Just as Jacob poured oil on the altar at Bethel, this item is always a type of the Holy Spirit and was poured out as a power at Pentecost to those who were in the upper room when the tongues of fire arrived. Just as God protected Jacob and his people in their last travel time, putting fear in the cities that they passed, his prophet Isaiah taught us in Isaiah 62 that God will make Jerusalem a praise on earth. We must also make note of the last portion of chapter 35, which begins to explore the family of Esau and his many descendants. Esau had been presented to us with some degree of nobility in the reconciliation of Jacob. God's choice of Jacob over Esau from the womb is very clear to us and provides us a strong lesson in the doctrine of election. The Bible strongly chooses to follow the Jacob line forward, but we will see a view in chapter 36 of the Esau line. Centuries later, the Muslims will choose Esau as their own, continuing the division of family against the children of Jacob, which continues even until today. We will see as we travel in our study journey that the sons of Jacob seem to cause more trouble than the sons of Esau in the near future. After the death of Rachel, Reuben has sinful sexual relations with her maid Bilhah, his father's concubine. As a result of that sin, Reuben, his father's eldest son, forfeited his birthright to his younger brother Simeon. But previously, as we've just discussed, both Simeon and Levi had forfeited their birthrights because of the many murders and sin against Hamor and the Shechemites. Therefore, the birthright from Jacob himself fell all the way to Judah, who we see later as the son of Jacob, from whom was descended Jesus. Our scriptural proof of this matter is given in Matthew 1:2. And after a long life of 180 years, we now are told that Isaac has died. He was buried by his sons, and therefore, after Jacob was the heir of the original covenant that was given to Abraham by God, Jacob was allowed to have about 12 years together before Isaac died. And Jacob was able to tell his father all about his travels, his relationship with the Lord, and why now his name was no longer Jacob, but had been changed by God to Israel. Jacob and Esau were 120 years old when they together buried Isaac in the same cave that held Abraham and Sarah. Next week, we will begin a study journey to examine the life of Joseph and his brothers. I hope to see you here.